Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to be covering the concept of model binding in ASP.NET MVC. In previous week's lectures we've been working on the development of what we are kind of terming the Week 4 MVC app, or that's at least the name of this project. What this project is going to do for us is enable us to build a student scheduler or scheduling manager for a school district. So the way that this application works is that it's going to have three basic pieces of functionality. It's going to have a student area, a manager's area, or if you want to think of it as an administrator's area, and then there will be a teacher's area. In the video last week, we talked about the ideas of creating kind of pre-planning our project and then going through and building our models and getting our controller flow set up and defining the controller actions, and then we went through a little bit of the mechanics. This video in particular I want to focus on is the idea of model binding, and what that means is that within MVC our controllers, our models, and our views all work very interconnected with one another. And to be an effective object-oriented developer, you want to deal with objects as often as possible, dealing with primitive types such as strings or numbers. Date time is even considered somewhat of a primitive type. Booleans. When you're dealing with these types as single standalone variables, you aren't really leveraging the functionality that you gain through object-oriented development. And what you're really gaining there in doing object-oriented development is that you're working with units, or sometimes I like to think of them as widgets. And these widgets, or your classes, allow you to expand and grow a class without having to go through and necessarily touch inside of your code everywhere you would add an additional primitive type, such as an email address or a name field or any other kind of property. So by utilizing classes, you kind of build these self-standing or autonomous units, and then you're able to manipulate and extend those and grow those over time without having to go back and visit everywhere you use that particular class. So with keeping that concept in mind, when we're dealing with receiving parameters or values from our MVC views, primarily through form submissions, we want to not expect these parameters to come in as individual primitive types, such as what you see here on line 23, where we have our login post action, where we're currently expecting an email address string and a password of string. What we want is we want to receive a student object that contains the email address and password. Now, before we dive into the idea of model binding, I do want to just kind of revisit this for a moment about how this application runs, particularly how this controller is interfaced, and what happens when we get into this action result, or this action of login. So I will go ahead and run my application, and we will navigate to student/login, and we'll get our login view, and we'll just go ahead and log in with the account that I've created inside of my database, and I will hit submit. Now what happens here is I'll hit a breakpoint. I set this breakpoint inside of my action, so upon hitting submit I enter this action login. My username and password from my form, from these two text boxes, are then passed upon submission, and I capture them here in these two parameters of email address and password. I can go through and do my authentication, validate all of my actions, and then determine whether or not the user did authenticate or log in correctly. And everything works as would be expected. I can log in and I can see my list of students. The scenario, though, is that what if in the future I'm going to be requiring additional pieces of information or additional details around the student in order for them to log in. Say, for example, I need their last name. Now, this is an overly simplified scenario, but the idea is I don't want to have to go back and keep revising this login parameter collection every time a new value gets included in the post or the submit from the form. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and stop my code, and then instead of expecting an email address and password strings, I'm going to just put my parameter as a student. And I'll make my parameter variable named student as well. And then inside of my code where I have email address, password, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change these to say student dot email address and student dot password. Now I also declared a student variable inside of my code, so I'll probably change this from student to dbstu. And that's just to help kind of differentiate the parameter student versus the student that's coming out of the repository. So dbstu will be my repository student, and just the regular student variable will be the student coming in as a parameter. Now, by doing this, I'm going to jump back over to our login view. We'll notice that the model for this view is also student. And because the model on our view is student, we can expect our action to pass us a parameter of student. So if you remember from earlier, what we did is we did this html.label4 and html.textbox4. These HTML statements, or HTML helpers as they're called, allow us to do a level of mapping between the model, student, and the properties that these text boxes or password boxes or labels reference. So by using these expressions, where email address, then we're able to say create a text box for the email address of our model, which is student. And then ASP.NET MVC and these HTML helpers do the work of creating our text box, ensuring that they match to the property from our model, so that upon submission back to the controller, that these values match up with what's expected within our controller. So let's go ahead and we'll run this again. And something that you may notice quite often is that I'm using Chrome for a lot of my development. And there's a number of different reasons why I use Chrome, but I personally prefer it because of the additional tools that Chrome provides. This tool in particular is called the Inspector or Developer Toolset. And this additional window, you can get to it by going to your menu, Tools, and then clicking on Developer Tools, or you can press Ctrl-Shift-I. So if I right click on this control and say Inspect Element in my Developer Tools, we'll notice that it brings up the HTML for our page. And in here, it'll tell us the ID and the name of this particular input box. And the name is the piece of information that we're most interested in, because the names of our input controls or elements is what is used upon the form submission. So here's our form action. Form action is for it to post back to the student controller login action. So whatever is on this form and then is eventually submitted back when we click the submit button will be pushed back to the student/login or student controller login action utilizing the post or HTTP post method. So the first input text box is email address. The second input text box is password. And because these names match the names of our properties in our code, the model binding that occurs natively within the ASP.NET MVC framework will actually take and work to do name matching against properties that exist inside of the student class. So within our student class, we have an email address and a password property. So MVC is actually going to go through and it'll look at everything that's posted back to our form or back to our controller, and it will actually try to match up as much as it can by doing a series of inferences and looking at conventions of naming and how things are organized. And it does a very good job, especially when you use the helpers alongside with the models, because it will basically do the work of packing and unpacking it for you. Now there is additional ways to kind of force that packing and unpacking, and once you kind of get an understanding of how those pieces work, where it packs up or builds your HTML posts, and then how it unpacks those posts and puts them into your objects, you can start to kind of mimic or manipulate those a little bit, if needed, to your advantage. So I'm going to jump back here to our developer tools again within Chrome, and we'll pull up the window. And what I'd like to now do is I'm going to flip to the network tab, and I'm going to log in again. And now this network tab under the developer tools allows us to actually watch the network requests as they travel from the browser to the server. Now you notice this happened fairly quickly, but what happened here is that this login request, I'm going to jump back to the header for a moment, is submitted to our local host server with /student/login as a post. Now that post was the form submission. Then what happens is that that form submission occurs. This is the HTTP header that is attached to our post. And then here underneath form data, it actually shows us the data that's being pushed to the server. Now this is a nice parsed out view of the form data, but if we click on view source, we'll see email address equals Gantoka, and then it does an encoding, URL encoding of the @ symbol, and converts it to a, it's not a hex notation, but it's somewhat of a hex equivalent. If you look up different types of ASCII tables, you'll find that there are conversion sets for this. But %40 means the @ symbol. So it's Gantoka at ucmail.uc.edu. Then we have an ampersand, which means that that's the end of the value and the beginning of the next key or property name. And then password equals, and then in this case, the password is just password. So this data is actually pushed back to the server. ASP.NET MVC then picks up that data, parses it, and then tries to create an instance of student and store those values into the student properties. So if we jump back one more time and we'll do another login, we'll go ahead and hit submit. We're going to hit our breakpoint within our action. We can mouse over student, and we can expand the student parameter. And then we see here how the binder, the model binding, actually went through and it took the values from those HTTP parameters and it put them into the student object properties. So there's Gantoka at ucmail.uc.edu inside of the email address, and then the password string inside of password. The other properties it could not find matches for, so such as first name, last name, ID, mail address, and student ID. The reason for that is because they were not part of the form submission. So it could not do any matchups to pull data from the HTTP post and put them into our model. And because of that, it leaves them with what is generally considered the default values. So everything here except for ID are all strings, and strings are nullable, so it defaulted them to null. ID is an integer. You cannot have nullable integers if you're using the standard int type, so that defaults then to a 0. So this is the basic concept behind model binding, is this ability to take data from an HTTP form and then let the MVC system kind of push it or inject it into a model. Again, there's additional functionality and features that you can use with model binding, but the basic mechanics are simply by using your HTML helper methods when you're projecting or pushing out models, and then that will create your controls for you. And then by utilizing those helpers, when you do form submissions, that form data will come back to you in the appropriate model type. Now, the one last piece of recommendation before I end this particular video is that whatever your model is that you're either sending to a page or you're expecting back from a page, they should be consistent. So in this case, we're expecting a student back, so the view should be bound to the same model of student. That just ensures a greater level of consistency between what your view posts back to your action and what your action is expecting and when it does the model binding. There are workarounds and there are kind of gray areas around doing all of this, but kind of as a easy rule of thumb, it's always good to make sure that your views and your controller actions are utilizing the exact same model. Thanks.